So finishing up with the endocrine system, when we left off, we were talking about the absorptive and post-absorptive state. Okay, so what we're talking about when we talk about the absorptive and post-absorptive states is that we're talking about basically what part of metabolism is happening. So whether we're breaking down stored energy or whether we're building up our energy stores. So these are both going to be related to when you've last eaten. The absorptive state is basically when you're absorbing glucose from your food, you're taking in nutrients. We're going to then be building up our stores of energy, our stores of fat. We're going to be building proteins. So we can see that if we look at the energy in our system during the absorptive state, the energy input to the body, so like the energy that you're eating in the form of food, is going to be more than your energy output, right? You're eating, you're not going for a run during the absorptive state. Okay. This lasts for about 3 or 4 hours after a meal, so you don't have to be actively munching on your food the whole time. It's going to take a little while as the food moves through your system. So glucose is the primary energy source for cells. So during the absorptive state, we're going to see glucose in the blood. And our goal is to soak up that glucose and store it. A very important storage of this glucose is going to be in the liver and muscle cells specifically. We're going to store our energy as glycogen. We're also going to put away energy into the form of adipose tissue in triglycerides, so in fats, because as we saw when we looked at beta oxidation in our metabolism unit, fats are really efficient at storing energy because we basically only need 2 carbons to get a whole lot of ATP out. Okay. So the hormone that's going to be responsible for this is insulin. So if we look at a map of everything that's happening during the absorptive state, you can see we start with the absorption of small nutrients, right? So we're absorbing things from our food. So this is going to have a bunch of different effects on our blood, right? As we're absorbing stuff, we're pulling glucose into the blood. We're also putting fatty acids in, right? Maybe eat something with some fat. We're also putting amino acids in, right? Lots of food has protein. We want to eat all different types of foods, carbohydrates, lipids, fats, all good for us in certain quantities. Okay. So we're going to take that glucose. A bunch of our body cells are going to just use that glucose, right? Our cells do still need to function, so we can use glucose in most of the body during the absorptive state because we have plenty of glucose. I'm highlighting this because during the post-absorptive state, we'll see that we're going to try and save glucose for the brain and nerves because it's most important for them. But during the absorptive state, everybody can use it. We're saving up glucose, linking it together with covalent bonds. So we're putting it into the form of glycogen in the liver and muscle. And we can see that some of it is going over here to the liver and adipose tissue as well. Okay. Our fatty acids, mainly going to the liver and adipose tissue. So what we're creating, right, are glycerol and fatty acids, and we're joining them together to form triglycerides, so our fat stores. Our amino acids are going to help us build up protein, mainly in our muscle cells. The amino acids are also going to go to the liver, where they'll be converted to fatty acids that can then be converted to fat as well. So basically, we're just building up lots of stuff. So this is basically an anabolic state, right? We're building up things bigger. The post-absorptive state is the opposite. So during our post-absorptive state, our energy input is going to be less than our energy output. Right? So we're not eating, we're not absorbing stuff, but we are still using a bunch of energy, right? Our body still has to function, even if it's been 6 hours since our last meal. So this means that we're going to save the glucose that we still have for the nervous system. So this is called glucose sparing. But basically, other tissues can use fatty acids and other sources for energy. We talked about how we can break down fatty acids, how we can break down proteins for energy if we need to. The nervous system really basically can't do that, so we're going to feed them glucose exclusively, and we're going to save it for them. So we're going to be taking those stored nutrients that we stored during the absorptive state. We're going to be breaking them down, mobilizing them, okay? Our hormone that we're thinking about while we're thinking about the post-absorptive state is glucagon. We have separate slides on insulin and glucagon, but I just find it most useful to immediately associate them with the state we're talking about. So here we're looking at what's going on during the post-absorptive state. So we're using glucagon. What we're doing is we're breaking down molecules, right? We're breaking it down. So we can see here at the bottom, we're actually going to look at the bottom first, right? This bottom right corner, see nervous tissue, right? So our nervous tissue, our nervous system, we can see what needs to get fed into that nervous system is glucose. And largely that glucose is coming from breaking down glycogen in the liver and muscle. So when we can break down those bonds between glucose molecules, and feed them to our nervous tissue in the form of glucose. And we can also make new glucose. So we talked about gluconeogenesis way back when. So we will also partially be making new glucose. Okay. Other things that are going on at the same time, but we're breaking down our fats, right, in our adipose tissue and our fat tissue. Some of those are going to the liver, so we may use ketones. We're taking those fatty acids, we're doing beta oxidation, we're using that for energy. Sometimes we're also breaking down proteins into amino acids and using that for energy in non-nervous tissue. So non-nervous tissue can use a bunch of different sources for energy, and we saw that briefly during our metabolism unit when we saw basically how these different types of molecules hop in to our basic cellular respiration machinery at different points, but we're saving glucose for the nervous tissue. Okay, so when we're thinking about regulation of these two states, we're going to be thinking about hormones. So we have two hormones that basically tell the body to do these things. So those functions we just talked about are going to be mediated by our hormones insulin and glucagon. They're opposites, they're antagonizing hormones, they have opposite effects. Insulin will be our hormone of the absorptive state, telling us to absorb everything, store it as energy. Glucagon is going to be our hormone of the post-absorptive state, telling us to take stuff out of our cells, break it down, use fats, proteins, whatever we got for food for our cells. We will see that there are some other important, semi-important, less important regulators. So epinephrine, the sympathetic nervous system, will be involved in our absorptive and post-absorptive state. Also, the parasympathetic nervous system, remember, was our rest and digest nervous system. So these nervous systems will be active as well during different parts of these states, but mainly we're thinking about insulin and glucagon. A quick reminder of where insulin comes from, okay? So we're thinking about our pancreas, and specifically we're thinking about the endocrine pancreas. So we have endocrine cells located in the islets of Langerhans inside our pancreas. So our insulin comes from beta cells specifically. So here we see our green beta cell. That's going to secrete our insulin. Insulin does anabolism. So anabolism is building stuff up. Anabolic is a process that builds something up, builds larger molecules. So we're doing anabolism to build up energy stores. This means we're making glycogen. We can take glucose, smack them together, make big branching chains of glucose, and store them as glycogen. And we can also tack together a bunch of fatty acids with a glycerol, create triglycerides, so our fats. And we're going to be promoting the use of glucose for energy for creation of storage molecules. So we're going to be increasing the uptake of glucose into our cells. So we're going to see that insulin is basically going to tell your cells to increase, for example, receptors and transporters involved with pulling glucose out of the blood and into the cells so that we can do these different processes. It's not that helpful to just have glucose in the blood. We also need to take it into the cells. So that's an important function of insulin as well. At the same time as we're building up molecules, moving glucose into cells in order to build up these molecules, we're going to decrease catabolism. So catabolism is breaking stuff down, making smaller molecules. So basically, right, while we're building up glycogen, while we're storing glucose as glycogen, wouldn't make sense to be breaking down a lot of glycogen at the same time. We're going to focus on anabolism and stop breaking stuff down. Okay, so insulin secretion increases during the absorptive state, right? Remember, we really want to associate insulin, absorptive state. And we're going to know that it's time to secrete this insulin by looking at the blood, basically. So in the plasma, it's where we're going to see these little nutrients, right, including glucose. So if you see a bunch of glucose in the blood, right, your body doesn't want glucose just hanging around in your blood. It wants to store that, right? If we got a lot of glucose, we want to store it for later. So once we see increased glucose in the plasma, that's when insulin gets secreted, right? Increased glucose in the plasma, oh, we should store that. Insulin's going to help us. Same thing with amino acids, basically. So amino acids, that means we're eating a protein-heavy meal potentially, right? If we see increased amino acids in the plasma, we still want to pull those into our cells, build stuff up. We'll also see that the parasympathetic nervous system, right, is associated with insulin secretion. We said the parasympathetic nervous system is the branch of our autonomic nervous system. That's the rest and digest part, right? So if we have lots of parasympathetic nerves active, it's going to tell us to secrete a bunch of insulin, go into the absorptive state. So absorptive, parasympathetic. There's also this hormone called glucose-dependent insulinotropic peptide, long word, so we call it GIP. It's basically in the walls of your small intestines. It's produced by them as food moves through them. So that's going to work together with our insulin during the absorptive state. We don't need insulin anymore once we soak all this stuff into our cells, right? Once we soak all this stuff into our cells, we want to keep some level of glucose still in the blood. So insulin secretion is going to decrease when we move into the post-absorptive state. Hey everybody, it looks like I got kicked. So here we can see a big summary of what insulin is doing, right? So our beta cells in the pancreas, those are endocrine cells that release insulin. So we have a bunch of glucose in the blood. We want to pull it into our cells. So we're increasing insulin, which means that most tissues are going to take up a bunch of glucose, partially so they can use it, right? They're also going to take in a bunch of amino acids, and they're going to build up protein, and they're going to stop breaking down protein, right? You don't want to break down your muscles if you got plenty of energy. In our adipose tissue, we're going to be increasing our fatty acid and triglyceride synthesis. So we're storing stuff as fats, stop breaking down fats. So lipolysis goes down. Liver and muscle cells, we're making glycogen, so we stop breaking it down. Liver, this is related to the adipose tissue, right? So we're also going to be working on those fatty acids and triglycerides. But the other thing that we're going to be doing, a little different, is gluconeogenesis. That's making new glucose from like other stuff, right? We don't need to make new glucose if we got plenty around. So gluconeogenesis is going to be turned off during the absorptive state. Looks like I'm not the only one who got kicked out. Okay. All right. So the opposite of insulin is glucagon. Glucagon is from the alpha cells. So the alpha cells are these blue ones. The beta cells were the green ones. The alpha cells make glucagon, which is for our post-absorptive state. So glucagon has a number of functions. We basically are going to remember them as just the opposite of insulin. So we're going to spare glucose for the nervous system. So during the absorptive state, we could use glucose for whatever. During the post-absorptive state, we don't have a bunch of glucose coming in, so we're going to save it for the places we really need it. And glucagon is going to tell us to start breaking stuff down so that we can get more glucose into the blood and so that we can have energy coming from other things that aren't glucose, since we're saving that for the nervous system. So we're going to be doing glycogenolysis. So we're breaking down glycogen, right? I see glycogen, lysis means breaking down. We're going to be breaking down lipids. So lipolysis, lysis means breaking down lipids. We're going to be making new glucose. So we want to make sure that we have glucose for the central nervous system, which means that we're not going to just rely on that glucose in the blood. We're also going to make some new glucose. So gluconeogenesis. Neo is the new, gluco is the glucose, genesis, right, is creation. So creation of new glucose. We would refer to glucagon as a catabolic hormone. Catabolic means breaking stuff down. Okay. Glucagon is an antagonist of insulin, just means it works against it, has the opposite effect. Also, I have a stupid trick that I use to remember anabolic and catabolic. I have a friend, Anna, who's really tall, and she has this little tiny cat. And that's how I remember that anabolic builds big stuff up and catabolic is breaking stuff down into small parts. Don't know if that helps you, but it helps me. I don't speak Greek, which is where that comes from. Okay, so just another summary of glucagon, right? When we secrete glucagon, we're doing it during the post-absorptive state. So this can be triggered by the sympathetic nervous system and epinephrine, right? So stress, fight or flight stuff inspires us to break down our energy stores in order to get more energy in the body, right? We want to make sure we have tons of energy ready to do whatever we got to do to get away from a stressor. Glucagon is going to decrease during the absorptive state because we got plenty of glucose around. We don't need to be using these stored molecules for energy. So whenever we're thinking about absorptive and post-absorptive, just like when we're thinking about sympathetic versus parasympathetic, we have like trade-offs basically. So we might see a little bit of one hormone during the opposite state, but it's going to be way outweighed by the opposite one. So here we see a little pictorial summary of glucagon. So we got glucagon secretion happening from the alpha cells of the pancreas. And it's telling us to do all sorts of different things, basically breaking down things, right? We're going to be increasing the breakdown. I know that seems a little bit reverse, right? But we're increasing the breakdown of glycogen and lipids, which means that we're going to stop making glycogen and lipids. Synthesis, right, means making something. So glycogen synthesis, triglyceride synthesis, nope. The only thing we want to be making really are things that we can use for energy. So we're going to be making new glucose, gluconeogenesis. It just so happens we'll also be making ketones. We can use those for energy. We're breaking down protein. We stop making protein. Okay. So glucose, the levels of blood glucose are under negative feedback control. So your body does want to keep those blood glucose levels normal, right? It's something we're regulating. So a normal blood glucose level should be somewhere between 70 and 110 milligrams per deciliter. If it's not in that range, hopefully it's going to be regulated by insulin and glucagon to come back down or up to the correct level. So hyperglycemia, too much sugar, too much glucose in the blood, starts at about 140 milligrams per deciliter, right? If we have too much blood glucose, really need some insulin there, right? Or have a hypoglycemic state, right? Glucose is going to be less than 60 milligrams per deciliter. Neither of these are good for your body. So both of these are places we might want to intervene. Those glucose levels are going to be maintained primarily by the actions of insulin and glucagon. So here we see the relationship between blood glucose, which is plasma glucose. So plasma specifically is the fluid part of your blood, right? The extracellular fluid in the blood compared to like red blood cells, right? So the plasma glucose, when it increases, those beta cells in your pancreas get triggered to secrete insulin. Insulin is going to say, all right, let's move that glucose into the cells. Let's use it to build up our stores of glycogen. And oh, by the way, we don't need to make new glucose anymore. We've got plenty. This is potentially tricky if you're thinking about a flow chart, this next step. So when we have an increase in plasma glucose, one of the things that insulin is doing is increasing the uptake of glucose into the cell. So if you were looking at this picture from inside a cell, it would look like we were increasing glucose, but we're tracking it in the blood, right? Like maybe you did a blood draw, you did a pinprick, right? You're testing your blood levels of glucose. So because we've moved this glucose into the cell, it's not in the plasma anymore. So this is now going to show that our plasma glucose has decreased at the end of the absorptive state. So we had high glucose, we pulled it back down using insulin. So this is a negative feedback loop then, because once we have low plasma glucose, we're not going to do this stuff anymore, right? This was all a reaction to high plasma glucose. Once we got the low plasma glucose, we're going to do this. Once we got low plasma glucose, we're going to hit the alpha cells in the pancreas, right? The alpha cells in the pancreas, they're going to make us some glucagon. Glucagon, hormone of our post-absorptive state, right? So after we've absorbed stuff, we want to break stuff down, right? We want energy from places where we've stored it. So we're breaking down our lipids, lipolysis. We're breaking down our glycogen, so glycogenolysis. And we also want to make new glucose when we can, right? Because we want to bring that plasma glucose level back up. So we're going to do gluconeogenesis to make some new glucose. This brings our plasma glucose levels back to their original level. So this is also a negative feedback loop. As plasma glucose levels rise, we turn this off, right? Our other thing that's happening over here is that we are sparing glucose for the central nervous system. So this is showing us that a lot of places in the body are going to be using these fatty acids that we've mobilized from our adipose tissue. Right? So we broke down lipids, specifically triglycerides, in the fat cells in the adipose tissue. We put them into the blood in the form of fatty acids. And then most of our cells can use those fatty acids for energy. Central nervous system can't, so our central nervous system uses the glucose. So this says glucose spared because we're indicating that we're using those fatty acids in other places. Okay, that is really it for our endocrine section. These are tables showing us summaries of all the different organs we've gone to, the hormones they release, and the functions. These tables are intense, as you can see. So treat them one by one. I would focus on, in terms of our endocrine glands, the ones we went over more in detail, right? Hypothalamus and anterior pituitary, super important. Posterior pituitary, important because it's the opposite of the anterior pituitary. We talked a bunch about the thyroid gland, so I'd be sure to review that. We talked a lot about the adrenal glands, so I'd make sure to review that. And now we've gone through a lot of the pancreas. We will talk about the gonads later. It's important to know they exist, important to know that they do produce hormones. But if you're trying to focus less on certain things for studying purposes right now, because this is overwhelming, I would save those for later. Okay. This is summarizing the metabolic effects of the hormones we talked about in this chapter. So this is a little more important, and this is complicated, but it really shows us this sort of interplay between all these different hormones. So we can see the best place to look at this, I think, would be to focus on like the effect on the plasma glucose, because we want to know, for example, right, that insulin is bringing plasma glucose down, right? We want to know that there are a bunch of things that bring plasma glucose up, right? Glucagon, one of them we just talked about with the post-absorptive state, but also our epinephrine, right, from the sympathetic nerve activity, bringing plasma glucose up. And I'll try to pull a warm-up question tying kind of these things together for us for the future or for our review day, just so we can work through this in a little more detail, because this table is kind of intense.